Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. My name is Philip Stevens. I'm the Executive Director of Geneva Network, which is a UK-based think tank working on innovation and trade policy. We're delighted to welcome you all and our guest speakers to this exciting webinar on the role of life science to Egypt's economy and how Egypt might promote investment in this important sector. Let me just introduce the topic before I introduce our speakers. Economic growth in Egypt is rebounding as the worst of the COVID pandemic recedes, but policymakers in Cairo are faced with multiple economic challenges, from inflation to unemployment. And the COVID pandemic has shown the limitations for middle-income countries in particular of relying on low-wage, labour-intensive manufacturing and tourism for their competitive edge, especially in the context of rising wages, automation, and the move towards carbon reduction. And to create jobs and more sustainable economic growth, countries such as Egypt should take this opportunity to accelerate their progress up the economic value chain and attract investment from higher value, knowledge-based industries that produce innovative products and services. The innovative life science sector in particular should be a key sector for the Egyptian government as it looks to boost growth, as it brings with it significant economic footprint and provides many skilled direct and indirect jobs. And with Egypt's regional trade links and strong science base, the country looks well placed to attract investment into this high value sector. Egypt's at an early stage of its journey. It's a mainly generics based pharmaceutical industry. The question is, how does it make the move from the low value generics industry towards a more value added innovative sector that can help the country achieve its economic objectives? And what lessons can the country learn from those overseas that have already achieved this? I'm delighted to welcome three very expert panelists from multiple countries. Firstly, we have Sean Randolph, who's the Senior Director of the Bay Area Council Economic Institute in California, United States. And he was formerly Director of International Trade for the state of California, where he developed trade strategy and directed international business programs to stimulate exports and introduce Californian companies to overseas markets. He's also been a member of staff in both Congress and the White House. Ahmed Ali Abou is a founding partner of Hasuna and Abu Ali Law Firm, where he's been since 1998, with a law degree from Harvard Law School, and he practices across a wide range of business areas. He's also a member of the US Egypt Business Council and current president of the Egyptian Society for the Protection of Intellectual Property. And finally, we have Mathias Bauer, who's a senior economist with the European Centre for International Political Economy, where he writes on all kinds of economic areas, in particular international trade and investment, European economic integration, digital policies, and innovation policy. So this webinar will last 1 hour. I will walk through a structured question and answer session. As always with the Geneva Network webinars, questions and comments are welcome from the floor. Please type them into the chat box. I will try to read out them as they come up. So yeah, please do send in your comments. So let's start with Sean. Let's look at the big picture. Why should drawing on what California and certain areas of the US have achieved with the life science sector, why should it play a key role in economic development? I mean, what does the sector bring in terms of economic value add and jobs and so on? Oh, you're on mute, Sean.
There we go. Thanks.
Lovely.
Yeah, thanks, Phil. As you know, California, and especially the San Francisco Bay region, has one of the largest, possibly the largest life science sector in the US. The principal ones are San Francisco Bay Area, Boston, and San Diego, of which I think the Bay Area and Boston are roughly comparable in size. You could argue over which one is larger. They're somewhat different in what they emphasize. But the sector here has been extremely strong, and it's really one of where the biotech industry really began. You can argue whether it's the UK or here, but I think it really got going at about the same time in both places. Today, it is one of the key sources of innovation in our region, and a major source of employment. And I think one of the big advantages that's important for life science is, the range of innovation that it produces, and how today, especially, it intersects with IT, taking it into fields such as precision medicine and bioinformatics, which is really where the future of the industry is going at the moment in terms of the kind of breakthroughs we should anticipate. And a lot of that is based on the greater availability, it's early in the morning here, availability of data and of data analysis. So from that standpoint, we find that the biotech sector intersects with and feeds off the IT sector now. And there's a complementarity to how the two are growing. I think from an economic development standpoint, another strong point that we found for the biotech sector has been the capacity to generate employment at multiple levels. So it depends to some degree how you slice the industry up. But from the top level, of course, we have the research scientists and the people doing kind of the most sophisticated laboratory work, down to the technicians doing the production with an entire scale of economic activity through them. And so I think one of the strengths we found for this region is the ability to see where your product is going from the inception of the idea and the research all the way through the manufacturing, and then to the extent that you can capture every stage of that process with the large supplier networks that feed the industry, there's the opportunity to generate economic activity and employment of multiple kinds at many different levels.
Thanks, Sean. And turning to Ahmed, so California's particular advantages are quite well known. But what is it about Egypt? Why would Egypt be an attractive destination for investment in innovation in the life science sector? What is it about your country that might attract international capital that's obviously quite mobile and can choose lots of different jurisdictions? You're on mute. Sorry, Ahmed.
Sorry. Okay. Thank you, Philip. Well, Egypt has a lot to gain from investments in life science projects industry, and it relies on a long history of pharmaceutical industry in Egypt, starting perhaps as early as 1930s, and with well-established companies. Demographics also add to this reason why Egypt can be a good place to have a viable life science industry. We have 100 million plus in terms of population. We have a good base of universities. We have 9 million university students, plus actually the need for the medical service itself. Egypt has a wide rural areas where there's a lot of space to grow and to use the benefits of the so you have the manufacturing base that exists in Egypt. You have the educated, skilled workers that can do the work, and you see signs of this in the IT and innovation startups that you see today exist in Egypt and increasing with time. There are in addition the volume of products production in Egypt today in terms of pharmaceuticals probably is about 2.9 billion US in terms of value, $1 billion. So and it's increasing in the last few years at a rate higher than 5 to 6% on an annual basis. So there's a lot to really to gain and a lot to contribute from. In addition, Egypt has been since, let's say, many years trying and structuring its economy, its laws and regulations, trying to attract foreign investments, particularly local investments for sure, by granting different investment regimes with incentives to attract businesses to come to Egypt. We have this history since mid-70s, and our recent investment law issued in 2017 provides some additional incentives to particularly small and medium enterprises, which are large to us in terms of I think the definition is up to 200 million pounds, which is a big number for Egyptian companies here to be. So there's a lot of points that of attraction to both local and foreign investors coming into this field. The companies working already.
In terms of the pharmaceutical industry itself, what proportion of it is generic versus innovative? Do you know?
I think it's the numbers I've seen recently. It's almost 50-50.
Okay.
So branded or patented prescription drugs probably more than the 50% in the market. You have a combination of local companies and multinationals having manufacturing facilities in Egypt. So you have the big names already manufacturing in Egypt, plus the local industry, and together with some state-owned companies, they provide about 80% of the pharmaceutical needs of the population, and the rest is being imported from the original sources.
Okay, thank you. So there's great potential, in short, to transform the industry into a more innovative model. Progress has already begun, which is great to hear. Turning to Matthias, who we've not yet heard from. So you write a lot about the European Union, which has had mixed success at pharmaceutical innovation amongst its member states. Based on your experiences, what do you think are the vital policy ingredients to foster innovation based on your research?
Yeah, thanks, Philip. So thanks, first of all, for having me on the panel today. I think fostering innovation is much about fostering investment in innovation or encouraging investment into innovative activities, such as the development of new product services or groundbreaking stuff. And there are a few general recommendations for policymakers to stimulate investments, not only in innovative activities, but also all sorts of investment in facilities, plants, business model efficiency, and so on. I think a lot of these recommendations are about incentives. So I wouldn't call them levers. I would rather talk about incentives. And here we should distinguish between more general determinants of a country's investment climate and more specific measures targeted at fostering investments into innovation. So basically stimulation of activities in knowledge-intensive industries, such as technology-driven manufacturing or also life sciences industries. Generally, governments need to allow for and also protect economic freedom in the domestic economy. And this requires policymakers to make sure that politicians and regulatory authorities are bound by the rule of law when applying and also enforcing regulations. And this, of course, requires not only well-educated officials, it also requires low levels of corruption. And then this also includes sticking to certain procedural requirements, principles, and standards regarding good regulatory governance. And these principles are well known and well recognized, pushed for a very long time by institutions like the World Bank, the OECD, and the IMF, who particularly emphasize on evidence-based policymaking and evidence-based enforcement of implemented policies. What's also important in general is the protection of property rights, which also requires protection against expropriation. It requires also equal and non-discriminatory treatment to national procurement markets. Now, what's also needed to stimulate investment in innovative activities is tax incentives. Tax incentives are key for all sorts of investments. The mechanism here is simple. The more disposable capital a capable company has, the more likely it is it will be invested in productive things, for example, R&D in new products, services, and business lines. This was also recently highlighted by UNCTAD, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, highlighting that tax incentives are key policy measures adopted by governments globally to stimulate domestic investment and also to attract foreign investors. Before I come to a few practical recommendations, I would like to raise a general observation, which I think is important to understand and to be recognized by policymakers. And that is basically that it is important for governments to recognize economic history, which demonstrates that countries whose governments embrace free trade also benefit from high levels of investment and the exchange of knowledge, the exchange of technology, and to benefit from technology spillovers, which over time themselves have a positive feedback effect on the quality of institutions and the rule of law. So more specifically, amongst the practical recommendations to stimulate investment in innovation, I think the following things are important. First of all, governments should invest or at least allow for investments in well-educated and well-qualified staff, both through scientific education. Ahmed mentioned the number of 9 million students currently enrolled at Egyptian universities. I think governments should make sure that these students are enrolled in the right fields. Then it's important to make sure that research-intensive companies pay little or even no tax, in order to make sure that those who are capable to invest in innovation and able to contribute to a rich innovation ecosystem can do so. And it's also important to guarantee that smart people and research-driven companies or innovators per se can recoup their investment, and this will only be achieved by enforcing strong intellectual property rights. But again, one cannot stress this enough. I think exposure to international trade and foreign investment improves over time, of course, the effectiveness and efficiency of domestic regulations, the ease of doing business, and as a result contributes to economic development and structural economic change.
Yeah, sorry, thanks, Matthias. Very comprehensive answer, and you touched on a lot of areas which I think we'll delve into in a little more depth as the webinar proceeds. Turning again to Sean, I'm trying to draw parallels between the Bay Area and Egypt, which are not obvious at first thought. But Egypt is still in catch-up mode with some of its regional neighbors in terms of investment in this this sector, notably like Dubai is an obvious one. And in terms of life science, the Bay Area is not a newcomer, but is somewhat smaller than Boston, that area for as an innovation hub. Can you draw any lessons for Egypt as the Bay Areas try to catch up with other life science clusters in the United States? And what are there any sort of lessons that can be applied to other countries trying to catch up with their neighbors?
Yes, although I'd probably rephrase it a little bit, that depending on how you measure it, the life science cluster in the Bay Area is possibly larger than Boston's. I think it depends on what you're measuring, the kind of activity that you're measuring. So depending on how you do that, it's either the number one or the number two, and it is the oldest cluster in the US. I think the third major one, as I mentioned before, is San Diego. So between the three, I think they capture most of the activity, except for the pharma activity that you find in New Jersey in particular. Just kind of looking at the sector here, there's about 180,000 people in our region. Our population is about 7.5 million. About 180,000 people are employed there. There are about 3,000 life science companies, about 4,000 establishments, recognizing that one company may have multiple establishments. There's about $105 billion in economic activity here, just around life science. So when you sort of parse that out into the different areas of activity, taking life science broadly, about 43% are involved in research and manufacturing. There's a large component of medical devices, which is about 20%. About 17% are pure biotech, and then 14% are biopharmaceuticals. So you can see there's a spread of different kind of industries and focal points mixed in there, but together they produce that ladder that I mentioned earlier that takes you all the way from science and basic research through manufacturing. So looking at what enabled that, and what I'd say is enabling us or driving us to stay the number one or the number two, depending on how you choose it in the US here. Well, in addition to things that Matthias mentioned, one clearly is IP protection, extremely important, since more than really any other sector, there's an extraordinarily long lead time from the point of research and with the discovery research to the point where you have a product on the market, and an extraordinarily high level of risk for biotech companies in getting to the point when they're through all the trials and in the market. So it's absolutely essential that you have that IP protection if they're going to recover those enormous sunk costs and actually go into the black. In terms of policy levers, R&D tax credits, I think can be very useful. We've had them on and off here, but I think especially if you're looking to grow a sector, having an R&D tax credit can be very, very helpful. I think the foundations, though, that are really critical to have a life science sector, and again, it depends a little bit on whether you're really going to push into the innovative side, which starts with the discovery research, but assuming that that's part of the objective, I think it's really important to have a strong hospital system, to have kind of the interaction with the hospitals and the capacity to kind of have the facilitation between what happens in the hospital systems and the biotech companies. And that often relates to having a strong university system, or one or more major universities that have strong medical programs and life science programs, where you have the capacity to do clinical work, where you have the laboratories, and here, many of the founders of life science companies are already faculty at one or another of the research universities that are very strong. You know, we find for startups in general, like tech startups and others, many of them are students, but for biotech startups, many more than in other industries are actually faculty at the universities, and maybe they started off advising or being on a board of a life science company and then started their own, or they produced an innovation as part of their role at the university and then took that commercial. So I think having a research university that's very strong in this field is really a critical base for growing a discovery research-based life science sector. The other part is having a very capable workforce up and down the ladder. As I mentioned earlier, you know, you need the research scientists. You need to have also the people, the technicians who will be producing things, the people with a ladder of skills if you're going to have an integrated sector. And so I think it starts, of course, with the universities producing the people with this very specific high-level skills that the biotech sector requires. And then as you build down to the production level, and there's an important interaction between, you know, the lab and the production level as you build down to have people at multiple levels with the multiple skills required to support a broad-based industry.
Thanks, Sean. Another comprehensive answer. I want to turn again to Matthias. Sorry, Ahmed, we want to talk a bit about intellectual property in a minute, so I'll come back to you shortly. But still on this sort of comparative discussion about what Egypt can learn from other countries. And I know we haven't discussed this question beforehand, so apologies if it's sprung on you somewhat, but obviously the European Union has lots of member states with varying different levels of economic development. Are there any examples of countries that have started from quite a low base and have emerged as innovation leaders within Europe recently? I'm thinking particularly from Eastern Europe. And is there anything that any lessons you could apply there to Egypt as it tries to boost things for itself?
Yeah, I mean, there are, first of all, differences within the EU, and there are still differences between the EU when you look at it from a bird's eye perspective in other jurisdictions, particularly the US. In the EU, there are only a few countries that managed as a whole, on average, if you look at the innovation and production performance, to climb up the ladder of the value chain, mainly because of integration in international value chain, of which many are steered by companies that are still headquartered in Western European countries. When you look at the EU from a bird's eye perspective, the pharmaceutical industry still accounts for a very high level of value-added production and a high number of well-paid employees, particularly in Western Europe. Western European countries, which are economically more developed than member states in the Central and Eastern European hemisphere. And this difference between Western Europe and Eastern Europe in economic development and also the overall innovation capacity stems from the socialist heritage that Central and Eastern European countries still have to shoulder, especially the lack of entrepreneurship before the 1990s, lack of private commercial property, lack of the huge positive incentives that you have in a market economy, but also absent intellectual property rights. When you look at these countries, the innovation performance data for innovation performance indicates that many European pharmaceutical companies are actually still strong innovators. Some of them are based in Eastern Europe, and most of them, including those in Western Europe, are highly involved in international research and production chains that extend to third countries. And many companies from the EU are also still, I shall say, high value-added exporters. When you look at differences between Central and Eastern European countries and Western European countries, you realize that there is still a high degree of heterogeneity in what I would call key industry indicators, such as value added per person, investments in intangibles per person, investment in R&D spending per person. And again, this is because of the socialist heritage, which still kind of prevents Central and Eastern European countries to catch up, to attract the levels of domestic and foreign investment needed to show levels of high value added production and innovation equivalent to those in Switzerland, Western European countries, or the US. But what I think is also worth mentioning is that the EU as a whole will generally be exposed to much more competition in the future from third countries, particularly larger emerging market economies, whose R&D activities and also clinical pipelines expanded massively over the past 10 years. I think this is also a development that impacts on Egypt. And I think it's also worth to mention, and this is often ignored in the debate about big pharma, big pharmaceutical innovation, and so on. What's also often ignored is that the US is still leading in terms of innovation and high value added production of medicines. Currently, if you compare it to the EU, the average value added of medicines exported from the EU to the US is significantly lower. It's about half than the average value added of medicines imported by the EU from the US. While at the same time, innovators from producers from China and India are catching up. And the success story of the US, also compared to what we see or saw in the EU, is that pharmaceutical companies in the US benefit not only from strong intellectual property rights, but at the same time from higher prices in a very large market, which together fuels US American R&D and innovation and US global innovation leadership.
Excellent. So the IP rights are key. I want to talk about that in a minute. But Sean, another issue is localization. So Egypt is one country amongst many that is trying to boost its manufacturing and innovation in sectors such as this through localization policies, in which companies are compelled by law to locate facilities in the country in return for a license to operate or some other form of compulsory technology transfer. Can you unpack that a bit more? And if you think, what are the advantages and disadvantages of such policies, and if you think they'll work when it comes to building local, homegrown, innovative sectors? Do you have any comments on that, Sean?
By and large, I don't see those kinds of policies being particularly helpful, especially in the area of biotech. So the biotech sector, it's extremely competitive, and as I look around the world and around the U.S., there are many places, cities, states, provinces, and countries that have on their list of objectives the development of the biotech or life science sector. And so I think the companies that are in the industry have a lot of options, and they'll tend to cluster where that critical infrastructure is available at sort of the right policy environment, but the various things we've been talking about in terms of strong but focused university systems that sort of enable life sciences development, the kind of the scientific workforce, the supporting technology workforce, kind of the diversified supplier networks, all of those things, which are not available everywhere. And then the question becomes, can you grow those things? But they do have a lot of options for where to locate. And I think that with the global connections of these supply chains and all the options that are available, that sort of requirements for locating facilities in a country in exchange for access to that market, I don't think by and large they actually will encourage companies to think in positive terms about about that country. That if you have very large domestic market, of course, that's a counterbalancing factor. But there's another angle to that: is it a large enough and wealthy enough market to support the prices that biotech companies really need to recover their investments? So I think the short answer is I don't see that kind of policy being helpful if you're trying to develop a high-end life science sector.
And Matthias, are there any examples in the European Union of this kind of approach within the life science sector, or indeed comparable sectors?
In a way, yes. I would generally agree with Jean that such measures typically have a very strong deterrent effect on foreign investors, particularly those that are innovative and competitive because of their accumulated know-how and the ownership and deployment of patents. There is, as Sean, I think, rightfully mentioned, a size effect, a counterbalancing effect of a large market. You have this particular debate and impact in China, where you have a few local content requirements in place, or joint venture requirements, and other arrangements that incentivize or force foreign investors to move a certain amount of value added in terms of production and technology to Chinese soil. Generally, I think it's not an easy task to successfully transplant production from one jurisdiction to another jurisdiction, particularly if this jurisdiction is characterized by a highly different socioeconomic environment, including the availability of supportive infrastructure or skilled labor. In the EU, Philip, in the EU, we have recently seen the launch of a debate that is still ongoing about strategic autonomy or strategic industrial sovereignty. This debate is focusing largely on manufacturing, but also the lack of EU companies to provide modern digital services. It is motivated by the feeling that governments should also step in to improve value chain resilience. However, when you analyze value chains across industries, by the way, you realize that there are only a very few what policymakers would call vulnerabilities. In pharmaceuticals, for example, only a very small number of raw materials and APIs is currently imported from a relatively small number of suppliers from a relatively small number of countries outside the EU. And the EU is actually considering measures within the new pharmaceutical strategy, such as stronger obligations on industry to ensure supply of medicines, and also notification of shortages and enhanced transparency regarding stocks across the value chain. So it's more about communication and better availability of information. It is not as invasive as local content requirements or forced technology transfer would be. So it does not consider, the EU still does not consider blanket localization measures, which would present a high burden for companies, of course, especially SMEs. And we don't see this in our industries either so far.
Thanks, Matthias. Ahmed, thank you for your patience. Sorry for leaving you out on the side for the last 10 minutes or so. Let's turn to intellectual property rights, which I think both Sean, Matthias, and yourself have identified as being key determinants of investment into innovative sectors, life science in particular. But for a country like Egypt, which has a large poor population and potentially less buying power than, I don't know, the United States, what is the role of intellectual property rights in a country like Egypt, and why is it important? Why do you think it should be taken seriously and protected?
Well, before going into this, allow me to just make two comments on what I heard in terms of experience in the US and Europe and so on. There is no comparison in terms of size. So I cannot say that what the size of what Sean mentioned about the life science in California or somewhere else is in Egypt. But in recent years, there has been steps taken towards building an innovative ecosystem, a better investment climate, specifically for these types of industries. And there has been several steps taken using as I mentioned, the university structure existing in Egypt, all over the country, with the large network of hospitals that existing, a new healthcare insurance law, which was issued recently. So the infrastructure for a viable ecosystem for innovation and tying. I think nowadays what they are trying to do is to link universities. There's a project coming out of Ain Shams University, for example, one of the two largest and well-known universities in Egypt, with the in the area of healthcare, having innovation hub, tying the university with manufacturing facilities, with hospitals. So there's a starting trend here that tries to catch up with what's happening elsewhere. In terms of the startups, for example, actually in the last quarter, third quarter of 2021, Egypt, in terms of getting funds from venture capital and so on, exceeded, I think, what's happening in Dubai in the last quarter 2021. There is a lot of activity in healthcare startups happening and being recorded in international media and elsewhere. So this is on this side. On the IP, Egypt has been two contradicting stories. One is that Egypt historically has been part of the international system, the Madrid system, and everything else, and member of the TRIPS for a long time. We have a new intellectual property law since 2002 that in I can say 99% following what TRIPS obligation puts on Egypt. So from 1870s, we're actually part of that system. The law is there, and the law is let's say it's not perfect, but it's about to be perfect. The issues that Egypt has relate to capacity building of the enforcement agencies, the regulatory agencies that exist today. And despite several trials in the past 2 decades, still there is much needed to improve that capacity. And for example, you'll see Egypt as part of the in the watch list and the US system, although moving to a better place. So things are moving forward. The patent system is there. The government is trying to encourage linkage between the patent system and the industry. So there is some movement in this regard. It's not happening in the way that I think it should. There are some barriers, obstacles, part regulatory, but I think the most part is really capacity building. You mentioned the level of economic ability of the majority of Egyptians. That puts quite pressure on the government to provide, for example, pharmaceuticals and so on to the whole population in reasonable pricing. So there are issues that may hinder sometimes the development of this sector. But it's from what I see, generally speaking, there's a good direction towards improving the setup to allow the industries like particularly life science is not just in terms of pharmaceuticals, but also machinery and so on, healthcare, hospital. There is progress, and the role of IP is. I mean, I don't need to stay how important. If you want to allow investors coming in, and you must protect them. So in terms of patents, most of the pharmaceutical life science patents probably will be filed somewhere else, and then perhaps joined here in Egypt through the international patent system regulations, and thus getting the proper protection. I think there's much improvement nowadays in this file.
Okay, thank you. In terms of entry into innovation, I think clinical trials are a good starting point. Lots of middle-income countries are trying to attract clinical trials as a way of building up the innovative capacity of local companies. Do you have any comments on the relationship between the IP system and success in attracting these kinds of activities? And is Egypt doing okay there?
It's not the IP system particularly, but there was a lack of a law that regulates, for example, clinical trials. And there has been attempts many years ago, and then I think in 2018 there was a law which was passed, and then it was objected to by the president at the time. But today we have a law allowing clinical trials in Egypt, and also a new law that allows registration for biological medications, fast track. So there has been quite a good move towards a better environment in this. So there are things which did not exist a number of years ago, including clinical trials.
Sure. Okay, point taken. And Matthias, I know you've researched the role of IP in various different sectors in the European Union. Is there anything you could draw on from your research which could shed some light on the debate around IP in Egypt?
Yeah, in a way, yes. I think the debate, including the debate about the trade-offs between IP protection and reaching universal access to innovative medicines, is pretty much similar across the world. We have this debate in the EU, we have it in the US, Latin America, and large parts of Africa, including Egypt. Generally, I think a strong innovation system not only requires intellectual property rights, it also requires proper access to innovation by the greatest number of people. Bringing a new and also a safe drug to the market requires investment of a great deal of time and money in R&D with intellectual property rights, including pharmaceutical patents, data exclusivity rights, and so on. you want to stimulate people and companies to invest their resources in the development of healthcare solutions or solutions to social challenges in general. And I think drugs are a very good example for how technological solutions can help to cure diseases, or at least the symptoms of diseases. On the other hand, you want to make sure that the largest number of people can benefit from these technological solutions. And in the field of medicines, this is commonly referred to citizens' access to affordable medicines. And I think this is a debate that we not only have in the EU, we also have it in other parts of the world, as I mentioned before. Now, when we talk about IPR, I think there is certainly no good justification for legal provisions that grant endless protection, endless intellectual property rights, right? But nevertheless, most countries still enforce strong temporary patent protection and strong temporary market exclusivity rights. And in these countries, including Europe and other, let's say, more economically developed countries, we see that those countries who, on the one hand, provide strong intellectual property rights protections show not only a good track record in terms of pharmaceutical innovation, they also ensure that the greatest number of citizens can have access to effective, safe, and modern medicines. And this is achieved by an efficient public healthcare regime, which is largely funded by social security contributions or taxes. And this is also achieved by solid drug approval procedures, including clinical trials, as Ahmed just referred to. And that, of course, requires time and money to be completed. And I think in the EU, most member states, if not all member states, they already found what I would call a stable balance between incentivizing innovation and providing affordable access to innovative and safe medicines.
Okay, thank you, Matthias. And then turning back to Ahmed again, still on the topic of patent rights. Egypt recently is making efforts to carve out exceptions to patent rights for medicines, which has been observed with some alarm by the US government through its Special 301 report, including legislation to make it more easy to issue compulsory licenses. Do you think such a policy is going to achieve much in Egypt? Or do you think it will undermine its economic development ambitions? Do you have a perspective on that you'd like to share?
Well, there's no doubt that I guess I mentioned quickly, hinted to the pressure on the government to provide products and services and so on, reasonable price to a large growing population. However, the TRIPS itself allows, for example, compulsory licensing. And Egyptian law mirrors, in a way, that ability to impose compulsory licenses in several areas. However, I cannot recall, in fact, that Egypt has ever exercised any of this. So these are rules on the books, but there hasn't been a compulsory license, for example, issued as far as I recall.
I think there was a men's health drug in 2002 from memory, but I'm not sure if it was ever implemented. But
the pricing, there's an issue of pricing of pharmaceuticals, for example, in Egypt, and the international companies have always made their voice heard to the government over the years, and private sector in Egypt, including myself, trying to push the government to ease that system. We've managed to push them to ease the registration system, for example, for pharmaceuticals. There's a new law that enables this better registration system. They've taken away from the Ministry of Health, for example, several areas and created the new Egyptian drug authority along the lines of the FDA. And that has proven to improve the process and expedite registration and so on. However, in terms of pricing, it becomes a negotiation between the companies and the authorities, because this is the only item, I think, which is subject to fixed pricing by the government. So pharmaceuticals, generally speaking, not medical equipment. I'm just talking about pricing in terms of medications. And there is always a push from the industry to move the government to have a better pricing, to allow them to put more products into the market and bring in the new innovative medications and pharmaceuticals to the Egyptian people. So it's still an issue, but with the new system of health insurance throughout Egypt that is taking place, it's being implemented gradually. We have like 27 governorates in Egypt. They have introduced it into 3 and 4, and they have a program to do it over 2-3 years to cover all of Egypt. That would help this issue of pharmaceutical pricing.
Matthias, compulsory licensing, have you any observations about whether it's been successful or not? I mean, in terms of both fostering innovation and promoting access to medicines, does it achieve the dual objectives?
Hardly. That would be my short answer. I think ever since the TRIPS agreement, we saw calls for compulsory licensing from many developing and emerging market economies. These calls are generally motivated by industry lobbying pressure in countries that are already home to certain pharmaceutical manufacturing capacities, and they are amplified by politicians who run their narratives against big foreign pharma because it is appealing to many voters. However, I think blaming big pharma and international rules for the protection of intellectual property won't solve these countries' more fundamental problems with regard to the provision and coverage of high quality healthcare services. Now, I think some important lessons can be drawn from COVID and vaccines helping to treat COVID symptoms. And here many experts, not only from industry, many academic experts as well, noted that waiving IP rights would not scale up, neither speed up vaccine manufacturing and distribution. And common concerns are, for example, that IP rights are actually the basis for cross-border collaboration, contracts between labs, manufacturers, distributors, which will allow for safe and efficient market penetration, first of all. Then another concern was, and still is, by the way, that a waiver of IP rights will not waive regulatory requirements for vaccine authorization and associated long approval procedures in countries that need to import vaccines from abroad. And then it was also argued that it is questionable whether a waiver of IP rights will actually significantly reduce the prices for vaccines. And finally, and to get back to your original question, Philip, it was highlighted that a comprehensive waiver of IP rights will likely have a more negative detrimental effect on the incentive for future drug innovation. And here I think it is important to recognize that strong intellectual property rights are a precondition for structural economic change and also economic renewal over a longer period of time. And any political appetite for an erosion of intellectual properties now in certain sectors of the economy not only discourages investment, it also contributes to the erosion of trust in the government's ability to implement and maintain sound economic policies and to stick to the rule of law, basically. So in simple terms, it basically means that it comes as a tax on future economic and social development. And allow me one more comment on this particular issue. When it comes to the practicalities and technological challenges related to compulsory licensing, I think it's generally hard, and I mentioned this before, to copy or transplant businesses and research and technology intensive activities from one country to another. And in addition, for small or mid-sized countries like Egypt with relatively low purchasing power, it is generally difficult to attract investment as smaller countries basically lack the gravity of a large market. Compared to India, China, also Brazil, smaller countries like Egypt will always have a comparative disadvantage by default. But adopting strong intellectual property rights and other investment encouraging policies increase the likelihood that knowledge-intensive companies will ultimately invest in smaller countries, which most of them would not do otherwise.
Great, thank you. And that's, I think, a great way to wrap up. We've covered the whole ground. We've heard from California, we've heard from the European Union, we've heard from Cairo. Lots of progress is being made in Egypt, and we will watch with interest as the country goes from strength to strength in future. So it just remains for me to thank our panelists for joining us today at various different time zones. Much appreciated. And thank you to our audience for tuning in. I'll put this webinar on our website shortly and circulate the links amongst those who've registered. But in the meantime, thank you very much for joining us, and goodbye.
Thank you all.